Mark was in a support function while Don was fighting in the jungles. This book provides a background on key battles and events that shaped the military and political strategies throughout the war. Learn why we got into Vietnam and the steps that could have taken a decade earlier to prevent it. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Shaughnessy.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Are you going to use, which mic are you going to use?
Okay. All set? Thank you very much for allowing me to be here to talk a little bit about Vietnam. Most of my presentations are to civilians, and so I can kind of make things up as I go along. So today, I guess I better stick to the script, as they say. As mentioned, my brother and I were there at the same time in 1970. I was there from March of 69 to October of 70. My brother was there about February of 70 to about May until he got injured. You can see by the cover, it kind of illustrates that I sat behind the desk, he was out in the jungle. He's okay. He's got some shrapnel in his ankle and a lot of hearing loss from a couple firefights. And I mention that because you can see that vest he had on. We did a book signing last summer in our hometown, and he still wore the vest. And I said, what are you trying to put me to shame here? You know, you're still thin, I'm not, but he didn't care. So I want to talk a little bit about the compare and contrast of what we went through. And for most of you, you already know this. So I'm not going to point out the obvious differences of me going to supply school, whereas he went to AIT 11 Bravo in Fort Polk. And then I went on to Fort Sill, Oklahoma for 6 months, and then eventually to Vietnam, whereas he went from Fort Polk up to NCO school in Fort Benning, and then went to Vietnam. So obviously dramatically different. And during the writing of this, it was kind of interesting. We had been playing golf together for years, and I visited. I've lived in Atlanta since 1980, and visit my little hometown of Ashtabula, Ohio. We play a lot of golf, but we never talked about our experience in Vietnam. Until we both retired, and about 3 or 4 years ago, we sat down and he started telling me a little bit about it. I said, well, how did you get hurt? How did you get this shrapnel? And he started telling me these stories. And I said, well, I did nothing like that. And of course, what I did, he said, I did nothing like that. I didn't sit on my butt like you did. I was actually out there fighting. So during the period of time, I said, well, why don't you write down the stories and tell us a little bit about what you actually did? And he said, well, I'll tell you the truth, I can't remember. Because in the heat of the battle, as you know, you block things out. And what happened was he called his lieutenant, called his sergeant, and said, can you tell me a little bit about what was going on? And then there was a fellow who was writing another book about a Medal of Honor winner who was awarded on the same battle. And the fellow called Don and said, can you tell me a little bit about it? And he said, well, I can't remember much about it. I remember about 5 minutes of the firefight, even though it lasted an hour and a half. So he went to a Medal of Honor meeting and met up with 4 other guys who were there in the same firefight when they got assaulted. And during that period of time, this is covering about a year that I'm sitting there saying, hey, Don, tell me a little bit. Come on, tell me what's going on. And he said, I can't remember. So all of this started to come together. And he started piecing it all together. And as a result of that, during that same period of time, I said, well, I better do a little bit of my homework on Vietnam. I was there 18 months. After all, I knew everything, right? Well, it turned out I didn't know a whole lot. And so while I was doing this, I read about a dozen or more books on the subject. And I started looking at Drang Valley, which I didn't know much about. And then, of course, the movie, We Were Soldiers. And what prominence that had in terms of how the battle was fought by both sides. You remember, they kept throwing more bodies. We kept holding them off. And then eventually they were going to have an onslaught, and General Moore called in artillery, said, move that artillery. We need helicopters. We need bombers. We need jet fighters to come help us. General Ham from the north said, I can't fight against this power. I can't fight this way. And that's when they started digging tunnels, doing spider holes, hit and run. And that's the significance, I think, of the Drang Valley. And then we looked at siege at Khe Sanh. How was that tied to the Tet Offensive? Because they wanted to draw people away from the city so that all of the population would uprise against the Americans and support, but it didn't happen. And some of you may know that they stored weapons for 6 to 8 months. They had this planned attack. But when they went to get their weapons, the termites had eaten through a lot of the rifles. So they were sitting there just holding basically metal. So that backfired. Then the My Lai murders, Hamburger Hill, Cambodia bombings, Kent State. I went to Kent State. My brother and I are both graduates of Kent State University. I got interrupted. I was 24 years old, and they figured if you're 24 years old and haven't finished your undergraduate degree, you're probably taking the minimum hours to avoid the draft. In my case, they were exactly correct. I would call the school every quarter and say, how many hours do I need this quarter? It was 10, 12, 15, whatever it was. But they finally got me at 24, and my brother at 19. So I tell you this because I did the research and got all the facts and the figures, and of course you know what plagiarism is. It's when you steal from an author. But you know when you steal from a lot of authors, it's called research. I did a lot of research. But let me go through some of the slides. Some of you, it's familiar territory for many of you, but I want to show you a little bit something, and then I wanted to point out one or two battles that my brother was involved in. As you know, we were the chosen few. 27 million Americans were eligible for the draft during that period of time. 9 million, or 1/3, served in the military. 2.6 plus served in Vietnam. So, we are the lucky 10%, aren't we? Didn't we all feel that way at that time? And you can see there's a map here, and we have it in the book. So pick your spot, whether you were up here in Hue and Da Nang and the ASHAU Valley. I was down here in Pleiku, and we supported the Central Highlands. At Drang Valley, we talked a little bit about that. In Hue, that's my home, 43rd Signal Battalion. Those are the screens that we used to communicate throughout the country. Some said that the reason that we didn't get those screens blown up is because the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong used them just as well. That's me busy at work. I want to put it in perspective. And that's a beautiful shot of the Central Highlands. And I don't know if you've been there before, but some of those places, when you fly over, I'm a golfer, and I think, boy, what a beautiful area for a golf course. What a beautiful area for a resort area. And you've all seen them. I mean, they're just gorgeous, gorgeous areas. That's a guard. I won't talk a little bit about that because you're all familiar with that, but at night, it gets scary, as you know. That I put in there because we were business casual most of the time. Here I wanted to show you a little bit about, this is Rudy Mesa, but I really wanted to show you a little bit about the ditch right there. It's about 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep for the monsoons. And then our battalion headquarters right there. And we were lucky enough to have barracks. They were built about a year before I got there, about 68. But some of the guys that were still there helped build them. Before that, they had tents. Of course, I heard about that. That is Ko-Po. He's a mountain yard. He's indigenous to the Central Highlands. There are about 750,000 to 1 million mountain yards. They were fierce fighters. Some were recruited by the North, and some were recruited by the South. They said they never took prisoners. If you were caught, they didn't have enough food or time or sympathy. But he worked in our warehouse for quite a while until he decided to join the Army. I was driving down the road one day in a truck, and all of a sudden I heard my name, and I went over there. It was Ko-Po. I don't know whatever happened to him. I know the Central Highlands, when the North came through there, not many people made it. That is the laundry girl that came in, as you know, 5 days a week. Especially those of you who are in the field, I'm sure you have the same luxury. Change your clothes every 3 to 4 weeks. That's the laundry women who come in. That's downtown Pleiku. And every time I go by anything that smells of garbage, I think of Pleiku. That is, if you're familiar with Slumdog Millionaire, the movie, this is almost exactly the same. And the school children, and they'd love to come up and touch your arms because you had hair on your arms, and they didn't. And of course, it wouldn't be complete without a monthly show, somebody from Korea or the Philippines. And that's, now that's my brother Don and my older brother Jim. We like to say that was Don's first communion and his first cigarette. Unfortunately, my older brother, who was pictured there, who also served in the Army, died last summer from smoking. Don drafted and then went to Fort Polk, and then went to Fort Benning. Even though he was required and, quote, volunteered in 100-degree sun in Fort Polk with push-ups until he volunteered, he went to Fort Benning. He said it was probably the best thing because he learned how to read maps and call in artillery and so forth. That he said, otherwise I just wouldn't have known without that training. He said it probably saved his life. Flying over, as you know, we go commercial. My brother lived in these barracks, and he said, boy, that's good living. He said, even though at night, if you ate potato chips or anything salty, you would wake up and the rats would be licking your fingers. How many experienced that? Yep. That's the ASHAU Valley. As you can see, he said it was an absolutely gorgeous area. You just didn't want to fight in it. And you can see after napalm kind of blows it away. A good 500-pound napalm will clear the whole area out. That's my brother in combat. And I point that out because of the jungle. You can see that some people fought in more dense jungle. He would go out, of course, as you know, and go 50 to 100 yards a day, slogging through the jungle. That's my brother at rest, because I wanted to show that he didn't fight all the time like he says he did. That's Sergeant FRASER. He died last year. and he said, his wife said it was due to Agent Orange. My brother had a good time, an opportunity to talk with him and get some updates and information before he died. That's, as you know, supplies, the Chinook coming in, dropping supplies, and occasionally they would land and hand them off. Other times they would drop them. Occasionally my brother said somebody would get taken out by a case of pork and beans, you know, medevac. And there's, of course, the blivet for the water. And as you know, these guys lived in these fatigues for 3 to 4 weeks at a time, and about the only thing fresh they got was the water. That's Fire Base RAKKASAN, the artillery base. It's about the middle of, and then, of course, you're very familiar with outside the wire. And there's the artillery. There's the Australian shower, which, as many of us experienced. That's my brother. He did do a couple recons where he was dropped off and said, in 6 days, we'll see you over here. And please be there, because if you're not, when we touch down, we're leaving. So you can see he's smiling because he's done with recon. That's a map of the fire bases and where my brother spent a lot of his time. You can see there's RAKKASAN. He came into Camp Evans. Camp Evans threw away. And then there's RAKKASAN. And then down here is Marine, and I'll talk about Marine a little bit. And as you know, Ripcord was the final big battle where, quite frankly, some people say we won every battle but lost the war, but I think it's fair to say that we lost at Ripcord. That's Fire Base Marine. This was a fire base that was going to be a body counting mission, whereby 20 helicopters, six per. We're going to go in there and count the bodies, 1,200 NVA, sapper units. They bombed it, hit it with artillery. They hit it from the naval in the South China Sea. They got up that morning, all loaded up. They landed, and they literally landed on top of the VC and the NVA. And they were looking like, don't you know that we're here? They had bombed the wrong mountain. The old snafu, right? So they eventually, he was one of the 5 choppers who landed and dropped the people. The rest of them, the other 15 got out of there. They managed to secure it. That's Lieutenant Dicely, who lives in Mississippi, played for Auburn, played baseball. And that's Holly. And when they landed, Holly was shot. What happened is the chopper got hit. The chopper pulled back, sprayed across Holly, hit him right across the back. My brother thought he was cut in half. 3 weeks later, he saw him in the hospital. They had him pinned together. And he's still alive today. Let's just say that Fire Base Marine, after they secured it and brought in the choppers, they got hit at 4 o'clock in the morning. This is where we had, I won't go into a lot of detail other than the fact that we had a Medal of Honor winner there. He just came in, he was a medic, conscientious objector, got hit, tried to stand up, looked down, realized one of his legs was shot off. He wrapped it in a tourniquet, hit himself with a couple shots of morphine, and went and helped several other people. In the morning when they found him, he was laying on top of 2 other guys who survived. For that, he got a Medal of Honor. Unfortunately, the name of the book that they wrote about him was called The Troubled Hero. He went home, had problems, marijuana, and just couldn't cope, and eventually killed himself. That's Don. I say he's combat ready. That's Don today, smiling. He worked at the post office for 32 years, You know, anybody who works at the post office is always smiling. Especially after they're retired. Key events. I want to talk a little bit about Hamburger Hill, My Lai, bombing of Cambodia, and Kent State. These were the things that turned the tide against the military strategy. These are the things that where, if you add them all up, accumulative, they were the things that affected the decision, we have to get out of here. The troop levels, you can see they went down. Nixon's presidency reduced troop levels. Of course, my brother said we started out as a company and wound up basically as a platoon. Couldn't get any replacements. He entered the draft, Vietnamization from Mel Laird, and pieces at hand a week before the election. This is what was the undoing, so to speak, of the North. They had the China visit, Easter offensive. GIAP lost 40,000 troops in an ill-advised Easter offensive. The Christmas bombings of Hanoi, where Nixon basically said, I will bomb you into oblivion until you give up. And then I want to show you something. So the peace treaty was finally signed. General GIAP's memoirs, he said, what we still don't understand is why you stopped the bombing of Hanoi. You had us on the ropes. You had won. Victory was at hand. If you had continued bombing for another day or two, remember, longest war in the history, except for now Afghanistan, longest history of the war. If you had bombed us another day or two, we would have surrendered. You had won. But your media, it was the same as at TED, but your media helped us more than we could ever do on the battlefield. You had won, we knew it, we thought you knew it. We were ready to surrender. That's, now, many of you know somewhere in the mid-60s, early in the war, should have done the same thing. Many argue. 58,272 killed, others missed, 75,000 permanently disabled. Many people you never see. 80,000 seriously wounded, 150,000 lightly wounded, 1,300 MIAs, 591 POWs. I won't read all this stuff, but in 1982, as you know, the Vietnam Memorial was opened. So in closing, what we tried to do was to give an overview of, for example, why we got in there. Let's just start and say, okay, in 1954, French were lost, Dien Bien Phu, and Ho Chi Minh agreed to the peace treaty if it was going to happen in 1956. Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles said, wait a second, if we lose Vietnam, we could lose Philippines, we could lose New Zealand, we could lose Australia, we could lose the whole area, and therefore prompted up. So the question was that a good decision? Did that lead us in? Was that the pivotal moment? Was it Kennedy sending in his advisors, or was it when we sent troops in 1965 in Da Nang? So questions linger, the debate continues, and but I wanted to share with you my thoughts, and hopefully it conjures up some good memories for many of you and doesn't raise any bad ones. So thanks very much for listening, and I appreciate it.